Hello everyone and welcome to episode 3 of the series where we will be making a game from scratch in SFML using C++. Now last episode we looked at event handling, and in this episode we are going to look at custom cursors and settings. So for the custom cursor, the first thing you're going to want to do is add your own cursor texture, and if you're not sure how to do that, you will need to go back and look at episode 1. But just to give you a quick preview over here, if we go to our texture ID class, you will see that I have 2 cursor IDs listed over here, and I provide the file path to them right over here, and I load them in my asset manager. So before we jump into the cursor manager class, there's one quick thing that I need to mention, and that is SFML cannot directly change our cursor for our PC because that cursor is actually controlled by Windows itself, and SFML cannot access the settings to change that cursor. Therefore, to actually have a custom cursor, what you need to do is hide the Windows cursor on your window and then display a sprite on the window that follows your mouse cursor that is now hidden, and that looks like a custom cursor. So with that knowledge in mind, let's have a look at the cursor manager class. Now, as usual with the other singletons, this cursor manager is also a singleton class, and it has the following functions. It has the ability to change what current cursor is displayed on the screen, and a simple draw function because we know our cursor is going to be a custom sprite. There's also these 2 helper functions over here where we create our current cursor and we update our cursor position. We will go into the implementation for both of these very soon. We have 3 variables. One is our window where we are displaying our cursor to. Another is a sprite which represents our current cursor, and a texture ID for the current cursor's texture. Now let's have a look at the implementation. As usual, we have the getter for the singleton instance. We then have our function to change the cursor. Very important, if the current cursor is already the cursor we want to change to, we just simply do nothing. This saves us the overhead of actually setting a texture that is currently already set. But if it is a different cursor to what we currently have, we update the ID with this new cursor ID, and we set the texture accordingly using our asset manager. Now for the draw function, it's very simple. If the current cursor is not null, because this is a pointer, if we go back over here, we see that we create a sprite on the heap. If it's not null, we first update the cursor position, which we will get into later, and then we simply draw it to the window. The destructor gets rid of our sprite if it is allocated, and in the constructor we set some default values. Our pointer gets set to null, our sprite pointer, and the cursor texture is set to the default cursor. For me, that's this gauntlet icon. Okay, and then very importantly, right after we construct the class, for our current window, we make the Windows cursor not visible. And this allows us to actually see our sprite and have it not be covered by the Windows default cursor. After we set the Windows cursor to false, the visibility, we then create the current cursor. And that create current cursor function, all that does is we get our settings from the settings manager, which we will get into very shortly. But the settings manager provides us with the height and the width of our window, representing the resolution of our current screen of the game. And we use this to set the scale of our sprite that we use for our current cursor. After that, we get the texture size of this custom cursor, and we set the origin to the middle of that texture. That just makes it simpler when we actually move our cursor based on the mouse position. We will move it relative to the center of that texture, so that if we get to the corners of the window, our mouse looks normal. because if we set it relative to the default origin, which is top left, if we then go, let's say, all the way to the right hand side of the window, our mouse might go off the screen, whereas on the left hand side it will appear on the screen. It's just strange behavior for the user, so we set the origin to the middle, so all positioning is done relative to the middle of our custom cursor. Then finally we have the update cursor position, which gets called right before we draw our custom cursor, and all this does is we get the mouse position on our window and we set our current cursor to this mouse position relative to the origin that we set above. And that's it. That's all we need for the custom cursor, really. This means that throughout the program I can call on the cursor manager and change the cursor as I wish, and it should draw and update accordingly. Now let's have a look at the settings manager. Now the settings manager holds all the user settings for our program, and this will probably evolve as time goes on and as we see we need more settings. But right now we just have settings related to the window, which is the width and the height, representing the current resolution. We have VSync, whether it's on or off, as a boolean, and our FPS cap, which is an unsigned int, and this FPS cap really only makes sense if VSync is off. So the settings manager's job is to look at a settings file, which we have as an ini file. Right here is our ini file representing the settings. As you can see, there's a Windows section, and here are our current Windows settings. This is my screen resolution right now. VSync is off and the FPS cap is set to 60. Okay, so the settings manager simply reads and writes to this inis file, and that is its only job really. So we don't have a lot of functionality. We have get settings, which gets the settings struct, that is the currently applied settings that is in our ini file, and we have update settings where we pass it a new settings struct, and then it simply writes to the ini file this new setting. So the idea is you get the current settings, you change the parameter you want, and then you give it back to the settings manager in update settings, and it rewrites the values to your ini file. Now there are some helpers here like load settings, fill gaps with defaults, write settings. They're not too important. Basically these are just interactions with the library that we use to write to ini files, because if you don't use a library then it gets a bit annoying to do the file handling. So I just use a header only third-party library called Mini. This can be found on GitHub, or you could just go to this project's repository and copy and paste this helper right over here. It's a very small file, 780 lines, and that's it. Now if we look at the settings manager CPP, the very first thing is the path, the file path to our settings file, which will stay the same in our program throughout, and that's located in the data folder. As you can see on the left hand side, there's the data folder with our settings.ini. You will update this if you have a different path or if your path changes. Here's the regular get instance file singleton. Get settings simply just returns the current settings. Update settings, we get the new settings, set it to our settings. We fill gaps with defaults, which we will get into later, but basically this just if there's any values that are unknown or that you might have left out in the struct, it will fill it with default values, and then it writes it to the ini file. Okay, constructor simply loads the settings from the ini file, fills any gaps with defaults, and then writes the settings to our settings manager. Load settings. So what this does is it interacts with our header only ini third-party library. So I won't go too much in detail, but as you can see over here, it's very easy. The syntax, we go to the Windows section, we look for the width, height, VSync, FPS cap, we convert it to the right type, and then we save it in our struct. You will have to read the documentation if you want to know more in depth, but this is how I use the ini library, and it seems to work for me. We have fill gaps with defaults, which, as the name suggests, we simply have some predefined default values. Like over here, we set the VSync to false or the FPS cap to 60. These are things that I deemed most people should be able to have. The default window size, we just get from the video mode, SF video mode, we get the highest resolution, and we set that as the default window size. These values don't matter too much as long as they're sensible values. Everything should be fine. And then write settings, we create the data directory if it doesn't exist, and we pretty much write to our settings.ini file using the header only library. And that's it for the settings manager and the cursor manager. We're almost done with all the want to call it framework or groundwork to get started with our game. So in a couple of episodes we will actually get to start working on the menus and the actual gameplay. So stay tuned if you're interested, and if you enjoyed this episode, leave a like, comment, subscribe. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the description and I will answer every single one of them. Thanks for watching.